Having looked at directors' duties, let's turn now to the role of the board, the group. One of the things I want to hark back to is this idea that governance can have different levels to it. You'll remember we've talked about governance as a system, governance of a board or an organisation, and then the role of the individual within governance. To relate that to what we're talking about here, the duties of directors are actually on the individual. So when you think about it, when something goes wrong in a company, you don't actually sue the board, you sue the individual directors for a breach of that duty. So while that's important to know, what it doesn't tell us is what the group needs to do. One of the things we may not have talked about in detail is the fact that an individual director actually doesn't have any power. It's under the direction of the directors, which means that the board actually makes decisions. So unless a director has been delegated a specific power, they don't have any power. So while the board makes decisions, it's the individual director who's held accountable or responsible. Why is this important? Well, you see, it's not actually a problem if there is a bad decision per se. The problem is the actions of the individuals prior to that decision. Have those actions been due to self-interest? Have those actions been due to negligence or a lack of care and diligence? Or have those actions not done something that's required by the Act? So directors' duties tells you what you need to do when you're making decisions or when the board is doing something. It actually doesn't say, though, what the role of the board actually is. And that's what we turn our mind to here. What's the role of the board or the role of the group within the general governance of an organisation? Some key points to orientate this discussion. First is that management isn't governance in the traditional sense. And I'll point you back to those definitions from week 1. Governance is about making sure the business is run right. We also need to recognise that the power of the organisation is held by the directors, by the board. So they have to execute that. But what do they do to execute it? Well, there are some things in law, but there are also expectations in the business community. So these expectations tend to govern how boards actually act. Okay. So let's look at some of those expectations and how they've evolved with society. This particular slide is our kind of conceptual way of thinking about how the role of the board has evolved over time. You could also think about it, though, as the way the role of a board changes even within an organisation as it develops. Of course, this isn't a one-size-fits-all model. Organisations can vary, and it wasn't always exactly like this. But quite broadly, this model does give us a way of thinking about how we think about boards has changed since the inception of corporations. The first stage of governance involved the situation when corporations first came into being in a broad sense, and that would be the UK Joint Companies Act. I think it was 1854. So during that period, you had a lot of founders or the founder and family who would set up a company. Well, during that time, the management of that company was carried out by the founder and the family. And the reason you would appoint others to the board, well, why would you have anyone else? Often they were appointed for their reputation. So you might get a local earl or duke to join your board so that people would feel more secure in dealing with you, that they would put their reputation behind it. Now look, we still have people who are appointed to boards for their reputation and for the so-called halo effect, for instance, that comes with it. Another way of thinking about it is it's signalling to the market. If someone with a high reputation is willing to join a company, well then that's probably got to be a pretty solid company. Now what happens between say 1850 and the 1920s is you have a lot of these founders they want to retire, or in fact they actually begin to die. So what happens? We have a dilution of the shareholding, right? So now rather than just the founder, what we have is a whole lot of companies where we're getting a dispersed ownership, and a couple of guys, Burl and Means, document this in a 1932 book, The Separation of Ownership from Control. Why is that important? Well, for the first time, we see the rise of professional managers. The people running the company are no longer the owners. For reasons which we'll come to, the point of governance at this time was more about getting access to resources, particularly capital, right? Here we're going through the tail end of the Industrial Revolution. We've got the end of the railroads, etc. So actually accessing networks of capital becomes really quite critical as we go through these stages. That's often like the second stage of a company. When you're beginning, right, the founder who owns it, as the company starts to grow, it's going to need maybe venture capital or maybe a bank who might want to put someone on the board. So having a director from outside gives you access to that network. And historically, in this period, particularly probably this in-between period here, we have the Melbourne Club in Australia, the Rockefellers in the US, the Vanderbilts in the US, etc. There were these great networks of banking that would often sit on boards in these large networks providing access to capital. Now, a fundamental thing happened around 1980. We could argue the late 70s, early 80s. But what we have is the rise of marketing, which is really quite fascinating, right? Before that, marketing wasn't called marketing. It actually would have been called maybe sales or public relations. So why is this such a big issue? Well, prior to that, the real problem for business was actually one of logistics or costs, right? If you could make something cheaper, you could sell more, right? So for instance, Henry Ford's famous quote about a car, you can have it in any color so long as it's black. What's he talking about there? He's talking about keeping the cost of the cars as low as possible so that more people can actually buy it. By the time we hit the 1980s, something has fundamentally shifted though. We've essentially saturated the market for lots of products. So think about it today, right? You can't buy a DVD. You could buy a DVD player for probably, I don't know, $20, $30, right? Full of lasers and electronics. I mean, how do they make that for $20 or $30? It's incredible. A block of wood at Bunnings is going to cost you more than $20 or $30. So by making the DVD any cheaper, they're not really going to sell anymore. Instead, what has to happen is people start differentiating their product. So this idea of any color as long as it's black fundamentally shifts. It now becomes about customization and differentiation, and this idea that the whole product you're selling has to appeal to the market. This saturation of the market, one of the problems for companies becomes, how do we keep growing? And so we enter a period of unrelated diversification and new products that actually really don't work. And this cost billions of dollars. Same period, we did have the rise of Japanese manufacturing, which also affected the world economy. But essentially, particularly in the US and the UK and Australia, we had a lot of companies suffering during this period, the late 70s, early 80s. And one of the questions that people started to ask is, hey, how are all these managers wasting the shareholders' money? Right, back through this period, we've had a long period of growth, provided you could operate the assets effectively and efficiently, you would continue to make money. But something fundamentally shifts, that no longer is occurring. People start going, well, who's going to keep an eye on managers? Who should be in control? And so people start saying naturally, well, there's this group called the board. They should be disciplining management. We also have a very famous academic piece by Farmer and Jensen called which articulates agency theory, which we've been through. That occurs in 1976 at about the same time here. So now not only do we have this huge shift in what's occurring in the economy, but it's coupled with an academic theory to explain it. So we start getting this idea that the role of the board is to control and discipline management. The final stage occurs when you start thinking about the institutionalization of markets. So if we think about where about 10% of all of our salaries go, if you're employed, and it goes into superannuation, right? And most of us in our superannuation options are going to put at least part of that money into shares. Well, one of the most fascinating elements around the share market is how concentrated it is, particularly in a country like Australia. So what it means is many of these large institutional investors can't exit the companies as easily as what they once could, particularly pension funds, super funds, those kinds of organisations. So more and more what we're seeing are that these organisations are looking to the board to ensure performance. So gradually what we see is this increasing focus from just a signalling or reputation effect through to a networking or access to resources role, through to a control or monitoring role, and finally about ensuring there's sufficient performance in the organisation. And what we can see is largely as an organisation, particularly a for-profit organisation develops, we'll see that same role development pattern occur.